We could go into the ballots, or we could go into the overall. I'll give you another one.
Are you going to present this ever? Do you think like?
Let me just give you one more before.
Are you going to present this ever? Am I?
Joe Rogan did a 3-hour plus long interview with Donald Trump. Tim Miller of The Bulwark broke down some of the more interesting segments of this interview with Donald Trump and Joe Rogan. We're going to take a look at clips from the Joe Rogan interview as well as Tim Miller's breakdown of all of this. I'll share my thoughts from time to time. Let's get into it.
Hey guys, it's Tim Miller from The Bulwark. I'm here with my buddy Sam Stein. We both suffered through 3 hours at 2x speed of Donald Trump talking to Joe Rogan.
It's not 3 hours at 2x speed. It's just an hour and a half, right?
Okay, yeah. But it was a 3-hour interview. We watched at 2x speed, so we suffered for 90 minutes for you. And I want to go over a couple of the biggest clips. But the most newsworthy thing was just Donald Trump's complete incoherence on the 2020 big lie. There were some funny clips. Also, we should talk about like his physical prowess, which he discusses with a UFC expert. But first, before we get to the most embarrassing, shameful, conspiratorial Trump clips, Sam, what was your big picture reaction to the discussion?
Well, at first I was sort of like, 3 hours is just a lot. Like, I don't want to hear anybody speak for 3 hours. And in fact, I didn't want to hear him speak for 3 hours. About an hour and a half in, I was like, what am I doing with my life? I've made really bad choices here. It was just really meandering, honestly. And there was parts where you were just like, they were like, 20 minutes on, UFC fights and the microfracturing of ankles. And then, we had some...
I'm sorry, I thought that's where Joe sounded the smartest.
That's because that was his expertise.
Yeah, I think Joe sounds really, really conversant in the microfracturing of ankles. And
I gotta be honest,
UFC
Trump knew his UFC fighters, like the guy clearly watches. And then they were talking about like whales and like whether wind turbines were like causing them to come on shore. Like it just dipped. And at points, you could see Rogan was like, this thing's got, he even said, he's like, your weave is getting wide and we need to bring it back. But it's like two guys who don't really know much about the substance, but think they do. And then I think, you'll touch on it too. Like Trump comes off as just sort of like, not like a menacing guy, but just sort of a absent-minded man who just can't really focus.
Yeah, to me, it was reminiscent of like you're at a country club and you've done 18 holes and guys are sitting around and they've had a couple of beers, and they're a little tired and they're looking at the Wall Street Journal and they're like, "Did you see this article about the whales?" And they both read one article or saw a couple tweets about it and but feel like they're experts because they're rich and they feel like they can just kind of vamp about it. Like it felt like two rich guys just vamping about something they read 2 articles about.
Exactly. Okay, so there's like several times during the interview where they went on some tangent, and I was like, this is absurd. Like, there's something wrong here. And I was like, I think I need to look this up on Google. Like, where are they getting this stuff? And lo and behold, you'd like find an article. You'd find the article you clearly know they saw. Like, it was some NPR thing or some Wall Street Journal thing. It's like polio. It's like there was one time where Rogan was like, Trump was talking about polio cases being on the rise in some country. Maybe it was Haiti or somewhere in Africa. And Rogan was like, yeah, that's because it's polio vaccine. And I'm like, is it? What? And so you go online, you find the article, and it's like, yeah, there's like 4 cases of like people getting infected from polio vaccine, but like millions are being immunized.
Right. They're correct with what they're saying here, but I don't know why Tim Miller and the other guy here or anybody else, Sam Stein, would be surprised that Donald Trump would be meandering. I mean, he's the guy that famously people have said over and over again. I mean, the perfect analogy to me is he always sounds like a kid doing a book report on a book that he didn't read. But the thing to me that one of the incredible things about Donald Trump to me is this is a guy who was a president. And even though he's a grifter and a con man and all of that, I would imagine he could probably still, having been a former president, definitely while he was president, he could have said, okay, I want to know about polio. What's going on with polio? Get me the top experts on polio in the United States or probably in the world. So this guy could, as a president, presumably, you would have access to all of the most knowledgeable people in the world. But instead, Trump chooses to be a conspiracy theorist, and just be like a Facebook troll like his followers. It's just incredible to me. I mean, to me, that'd be one of the real advantages of being the president of the United States, or even a former president, is that you would have access to all of the world's top experts. But Donald Trump doesn't really care to do that.
And the whale thing too, I was like, what are they talking about? It's like, that really wind turbines causing them? And you look on his like, people say it's wind turbines, and like, actually, no, it's not. And so you can see the articles they read while they were done with their 18 holes.
Or that someone told them about in Trump's case.
Yeah,
maybe.
exactly.
And there's the Tad Lincoln. Trump goes off on how sad it was. How Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were so depressed because Tad had died, and it's like Tad died after Abraham was shot.
He lost his son, and the two of them suffered from melancholia. They didn't call it depression. They called it melancholia, and they suffered from it. He was a very depressed guy, and she was a very depressed woman, more so than him. And on top of that, they lost their son, whose name was Tad. And it was just seeing it in the little pictures, a little tiny picture. I mean, you can't see the details there. Little tiny, everything the way it was, a little tiny picture of Tad, who he lost. And it was devastating.
Oh, yeah, that was. I don't want to. I know we need to get to it, but when he said Lincoln had the yips,
again, it's like you might have somebody in the White House who is an expert on Abraham Lincoln, and Donald Trump could have just been like, "Hey, I want to know everything about Abraham Lincoln," but he probably somebody just told him this, like Tim Miller said.
It's like a putter, because everything is golf with this man. He's like, Lincoln had the yips. People kept saying he had the yips. I was like, what is he talking about? But, we probably heard it from someone and related like it's historical fact. So. Yeah,
my other two takeaways just on the Rogan side, the only Rogans I've ever watched before, well, that's not true. This is true, actually, are with subject matter experts. And so he comes off fine in those because like the expert is smart, and so he doesn't need to ask follow-up questions. He's like the dumb person asking the smart person questions, and so it comes off fine. I also watched the Peter Thiel thing, but again, as menacing as Peter Thiel is, he's smart, so except for one exchange on climate where Peter came off sounding very dumb. Joe Rogan doesn't seem that dumb because Peter is the smart one talking about AI and all these tech issues.
Peter shepherding the conversation.
Yeah, in this convo where it's a dumb man talking to a dumb man, Joe seems very dumb because there were no points where Trump says anything where he's like, "Is that correct?" There's one point actually, which we'll get to next. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's a great segue to what we're going to talk about with the election. But like, there's various points where it's very clear, like Rogan. In his heart, I think he wants to care about the deficit, right? And he kept talking about the deficit. And he kept being like, so why did the deficit go up under your administration? Yeah. And Trump kept being like, COVID. And it's like anyone with like a sort of simplistic understanding could have been like, no, sir. Like it was going up beforehand. Yeah.
Trump was saying the first year they had a surplus. At one point, Trump said the first year they had a surplus.
I know.
No, actually, no, wrong.
And so that's why this interview, I was talking to someone about back when Harris was like potentially doing this show. She might. I mean, Rogan hinted that it might still be happening. I don't think it will. But so there was like a week where Harris was doing Fox News and Joe Rogan. Everyone thought. Yeah. And everyone was like, oh, no, man, the Rogan stuff is really risky. And the Fox. I was like, no, the Fox one is the risky one. Rogan just wants to talk. Like, that's all he wants to do. Anyways, go to your.
And I'm sure even though Joe Rogan has said, some not flattering and maybe even terrible things about Kamala Harris, I would imagine he would do an incredibly softball interview with Kamala Harris, just as he did an incredibly softball interview with Donald Trump. Now we're going to see here, as Sam Stein and Tim Miller pointed out, we're going to see one instance where Joe Rogan pushed back just a tiny bit, just as Laura Ingraham and some of these Fox News hosts have pushed back a tiny bit on Trump when he lies because they're afraid of getting sued for $1 billion again or whatever it is.
Good point, because I think it's a good segue.
Yeah, and so Rogan's inability to challenge him is one. The other thing is that Trump, as you mentioned at the top, Trump sounds like a rambling old man, not like a menace. And I think this is important because when you hear focus groups of the younger men that are moving towards Trump that are kind of socially liberal, that are gettable, not the Charlie Kirk young men, but like, pro-choice young bros, Trump doesn't sound as scary to them as like some of us make it out to be at times. And so you have to kind of get underneath why Trump is scary by explaining what it is that he's saying that's really so dangerous. And that takes us to, I think, the thing that might not have to a layperson seemed that dangerous or scary, but was the worst part of the interview for him. And that is him and Joe Rogan talking about the supposed fraud in the 2020 election. Let's listen to that clip.
I want to talk about 2020 because you said over and over again that you were robbed in 2020.
Yeah, totally.
How do you think you were robbed? Everybody always cuts you off. I'm going to allow...
Well, they not only cut you off. Well, what I'd rather do is we'll do it another time, and I would bring in papers that you would not believe. So many different papers. That election was so crooked. It was the most crooked election.
Okay.
Why didn't Trump bring the papers to this interview? I mean, they had 3 hours. They could have gone through just about anything, I would imagine. And I would think that he probably would have anticipated that Joe Rogan would ask him about the election. And, of course, he wouldn't have had to ask him about it anyway. Donald Trump would have talked about it because he talks about it all the time. So why couldn't he have just brought the papers to the Joe Rogan interview?
But give me some examples of how.
Well, let's start from the top and the easy ones.
Okay.
They were supposed to get legislative approval to do the things they did, and they didn't get it. In many cases, they didn't get it.
What things?
Anything.
Legislative approval
for extensions of the voting, for voting earlier, for this,
right.
For all different things. By law, they had to get legislative approvals. You don't have to go any further than that. If you take a look at Wisconsin, they virtually admitted that the election was rigged, robbed, and stolen. They wouldn't give access in certain areas to the ballots because the ballots weren't signed. They weren't originals. We could go into this stuff. We could go into the ballots or we could go into the overall. I'll give you another one.
Are you going to present this ever? Do you think like...
Let me just give you one more before. 51 intelligence agents come up that the laptop was from Russia.
Are you going to present this ever? Am I? There's nothing. He has nothing. Like he goes onto the conspiratorial show, and it's not. And it's just like, oh, in Wisconsin, some people admitted it's rigged, stolen. And it's like, what? No. Nobody did that.
You would think that, like, I was a little disappointed in Trump at this point because you would think that someone who's like, swam in these waters for so long would have a better answer to this. Or like just being like, they didn't have.
But he didn't have a better answer because it's all BS. There's no truth to any of it.
Standing. It's like, come on, you got to give us more, man. If you're gonna buy the bit, give us a little bit more.
You can see Rogan. This is the one point where you can see Rogan. That's like.
Yeah, Rogan's
I do conspiracies, all right? Like, you got to be able to give people some meat.
I mean, Rogan literally said, I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to let you talk. But Tim, I got to be honest, like, even in that case, like, he seems confused and meandering, but he's just like, I imagine the layperson's just like, this is just like a confused old man. Not like, right. And that's, I think, a problem, obviously. I think, like, people don't really understand that, in fact, even a confused old man, in fact, maybe a confused old man is more inclined to do dangerous things than someone. So, I thought overall...
And this is where Rogan not asking follow-ups, right? Because, like, if I'm in the Rogan chair, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. You've given us nothing. Like, you're just like, well, they admitted it's rigged, and are you going to present anything? It's like, well, and it's like, well, wait, cops died at the Capitol because you made up this lie. Right? Like that, like the consequence of the meandering, Rogan never gets to, right?
And I don't really know why, and maybe they wouldn't, but I don't know why Tim Miller or Sam Stein would expect anything more from Joe Rogan. I mean, he gives softball interviews like this, and I'm sure, if you're sitting down with Donald Trump, it would be difficult to not do a softball, or not just Donald Trump, anybody at this level. But if Joe Rogan is going to have Donald Trump on his show, it's sort of his responsibility with the giant audience that he has, to ask difficult questions, especially when you have this 3-hour in-depth format. It doesn't have to be confrontational the entire time. They can, BS about fights and all of that stuff, and that's fine. But when they're getting into these serious topics, even though Donald Trump is an unserious person, Joe Rogan should be doing more pushback than the tiny bit of pushback that he does here. But what do you think about the interview with Donald Trump and Joe Rogan, Tim Miller and Sam Stein's analysis here? Make sure to leave me a comment about any of this. Tim Miller, Sam Stein, Joe Rogan, Donald Trump, anything else you'd like to comment on. I love to read your comments. Make sure to give me a like and subscribe. I'm now up over 35,000 subscribers. I want to get to 50,000, 100,000, and that's thanks to you that I'm at the point that I'm at now. I want to make more content like this, so if you haven't subscribed and you enjoy the content, please do so. This is Chris on Culture. I will see you in the next video.